It happened on an ordinary Wednesday morning. At 9:32 a.m. Eastern, trading floors from New York to Chicago went dead silent. The U.S. dollar index, the symbol of American dominance, plunged 7% in under 4 minutes. Bloomberg screens went red. CNBC anchors froze mid-sentence. And across America, millions of people refreshed their phones, only to see one terrifying alert. Federal Reserve announces emergency market halt. In a matter of minutes, the system built on a century of confidence began to fracture. And as the digital noise faded into silence, one haunting question spread. Was this the moment America's money died? What almost no one realized that morning was that this collapse had been building quietly for decades, and every empire, every economy, every nation that believed itself untouchable had once stood at this exact same point. Every currency collapse follows 5 stages. And America, right now, is standing on stage 4. When a currency dies, it's not just numbers that vanish. It's the soul of a nation. It's pensions, savings, and the dreams of ordinary people. In Cleveland, Ohio, Mark Dawson, a 47-year-old factory worker, checked his 401k every night before bed. He'd worked the same steel plant job for 22 years. His dream was simple: retire by 55, buy a small fishing boat, spend weekends on Lake Erie with his son. In Washington, D.C., the air smelled like champagne and power. Stock indexes were near record highs. Politicians were boasting about the strongest economy in history. On Wall Street, traders were celebrating another quarter of profits, fueled not by growth, but by debt, speculation, and cheap money. But below the surface, a slow, invisible decay had begun. No one wanted to admit it. Not the bankers, not the policymakers, not even the economists. Because admitting it would mean accepting that the American financial engine, the same engine that ran the world, was running on fumes. And as history shows, every empire thinks its money is immortal, until it isn't. But the first cracks wouldn't appear on Wall Street. They'd appear in the one place no one expected. The first signs weren't loud or dramatic. They were small, technical, easy to ignore. A delayed bond auction here. A liquidity shortage there. Headlines buried on page 9 of the Wall Street Journal. In 2026, the U.S. national debt quietly crossed $50 trillion. It barely made the news. Debt doesn't matter, pundits said. The dollar will always be king. But deep inside the Treasury's digital control room, a quiet panic was building. Foreign buyers, Japan, China, even Saudi Arabia, were dumping U.S. bonds for the first time in 40 years. And the yield curve, that strange, technical line economists love to ignore, was flashing red. Meanwhile, Americans were feeling it at home. Gas prices crept toward $8 a gallon. A carton of eggs cost more than a fast food meal. And yet, the official report said inflation was under control. They weren't lying. They were just measuring the wrong reality. The stage was being set, not for a recession, but for a reckoning. And it would all begin with a single failed auction that no one noticed, until it was too late. Inside the marble walls of the Federal Reserve, Chairwoman Ellen Monroe stared at a glowing red dashboard. Liquidity was evaporating from the system, fast. The bond market, once considered unbreakable, was freezing. Run the reverse repos, she ordered quietly. And no headlines. They were patching cracks in a dam with duct tape. And they all knew it. Meanwhile, Mark Dawson sat in his kitchen, refreshing his 401k app. The numbers didn't make sense. His account was down 35% overnight. He called his bank. The line was busy. He called again. Still busy. The headlines kept saying, temporary volatility. But Mark didn't need a finance degree to know something was wrong. Between the policymakers and people like Mark, trust, the invisible currency that holds every economy together, was beginning to break. And once trust breaks, no stimulus on earth can bring it back. But when the government finally responded, their cure would prove far deadlier than the disease. 2 weeks later, hope returned, or so it seemed. President Reed Callahan sat behind the Oval Office desk, cameras rolling. He smiled reassuringly as he said, "The fundamentals of the U.S. economy remain strong. The Federal Reserve has introduced a new stabilization package." The markets jumped instantly. The Dow soared 1,200 points. Cable news cheered the rebound has begun. But buried deep in the fine print, unnoticed by 99% of Americans, was a chilling truth. The stabilization package wasn't funded by taxes, savings, or production. It was digitally printed money, backed only by confidence, and confidence was the one thing the system was running out of. Behind closed doors, the countdown had already begun. Economists whispered that stage 5, the collapse, wasn't years away. It was weeks. And then came the leak, the one file that changed everything. The villain wasn't one person. It was the system, a machine built on greed, short-term thinking, and political self-preservation. For decades, politicians had bought votes with debt. Corporations had inflated stock prices with buybacks. And the Federal Reserve had turned the printing press into a political weapon. Ellen Monroe had the data. She knew how fragile the dollar truly was. But if she warned the public, panic would ignite immediately. If she stayed silent, the collapse would hit harder later. That night, she wrote an email to her mentor, simply saying, "We've built an illusion too big to unwind. I don't know which is worse, the lie or the silence." She didn't know it yet, but her silence was about to end, violently. 3 days later, an anonymous leak hit the internet. A former Treasury analyst had released confidential documents. The files revealed that the U.S. government had quietly defaulted on several foreign debt obligations, not by missing payments, but by repaying in devalued digital dollars. It was a secret default, one that violated decades of trust. The illusion had already crumbled. The empire had just been pretending. The world erupted. Foreign governments condemned it. Markets crashed. And then came the second revelation. The documents were signed off by Ellen Monroe herself. She hadn't leaked them. Someone inside the system had framed her. But she wasn't the only one about to lose everything. Within a month, the dominoes began to fall. The dollar's value dropped 40%. Foreign trade froze. Oil imports stopped completely. Within days, grocery stores were rationing food. Factories shut down. Jobs vanished. And people like Mark Dawson, people who had trusted the system their entire lives, were left with nothing. He stood outside a shuttered bank, staring at the system offline sign taped to the window. Beside him, hundreds of others waited in silence. No one shouted. No one cried. It was the sound of disbelief. In Washington, Ellen Monroe faced the cameras one last time. Her voice trembled as she said, "We can print money, but we can't print confidence." The empire had entered the same chapter every currency eventually reaches, the reckoning. But in America's desperation to rebuild, a new kind of money was about to emerge, one far more dangerous. Just as the panic reached its peak, salvation appeared, or so people thought. A coalition of major U.S. tech companies, Apple, Google, and J.P. Morgan, announced the launch of a new digital currency called AmeriCoin. A new beginning, the press release read. A currency for a modern America. It worked perfectly at first. Transactions were instant. Markets stabilized. The government praised it as the rebirth of the dollar. But then came the catch. AmeriCoin wasn't decentralized. It wasn't free. It was programmable. Every transaction traceable. Every account controllable. Citizens who questioned government policies found their balances temporarily restricted. Companies that spoke out lost payment access. In trying to save the economy, America had built a digital cage. The collapse wasn't the end of freedom. It was the beginning of control. Every currency collapse follows the same 5 stages. Confidence. 2. Complacency. 3. Crisis. 4. Control. 5. Collapse. And history shows, the final stage never starts with a bang. It starts with silence, denial, and a comforting lie. This time is different. The dollar didn't die in a single day. It died slowly, through applause, stimulus checks, and political promises. In Cleveland, Mark Dawson sat on his porch, watching his son pack a truck to move south for work. He turned off the TV as news anchors celebrated AmeriCoin's success. And quietly, he said, "We thought it could never happen here. But it always does. Because when confidence dies, money isn't worth the paper or the pixels it's printed on." If you believe the story isn't over, subscribe, because the next stage has already begun.